always a critical piece of every re-election campaign, because if you couldn't get that support, you couldn't raise the money. Why would you challenge the mayor? Ergo, a succession of clowns in these mayoral races. Now that I don't know that I've ever said that in any of my media jobs, but it's been a story that I've heard that sounded persuasive. And I know Ben likes the story, so let him answer second. Well, Rachel, do you think there's anything to that?
I do think there is. The Chamber of Commerce, a lot of the sort of business associations in town have been sort of supportive, but I would add that you also risk alienating members of the business community by offering TIF, and you risk alienating the existing businesses, right? Because the city has used TIF a lot to try to attract new businesses, new development to the area, and you have existing businesses who've been here for 100 years saying, "Where's mine?" And then, so then they figured, well, we got to get in on this deal somehow. Maybe we should move to new quarters. Maybe we need a headquarters upgrade. And I think one of the more egregious uses of TIF that we haven't brought up is the subsidizing of corporate headquarter relocations in the Loop. So moving from, this is not about a net increase in jobs, even though you could argue it's about retaining those jobs, even though you have to then believe in the idea that those jobs would have left if they hadn't received TIF assistance. But there have been many uses of those TIF funds to subsidize the relocation of one business from an existing building to another building. Oftentimes it's to a newer building. And again, as I said, as a fan of some of the older structures in the downtown, I'm worried that one of the unintended byproducts of this policy has been the sort of increase in vacancy rates in some of the older structures downtown as the city actually subsidizes businesses to move to some of the newer structures that were built during this frothy most recent commercial construction.
So Ben, which is it? Is it that is it a tool to keep the current business folks happy, or to risk alienating them, as Rachel said, by reaching out to new folks, or is it a combination of two?
Well, I think it's a combination too. Your analysis was really right on.
I probably read it in one of your comments.
Yeah, I wish I had said it, but maybe I have. But no, I love to tweak the downtown business community in so many ways. One of my favorite ways of tweaking them is that in so many private discussions I had with landlords downtown and property owners downtown, they love to tell me how they're all Milton Friedman free market libertarians when it comes to economics, and meanwhile they got their paw in the TIF slush fund. For a while I was taking great pleasure in writing that theme, and then I realized it was way too easy, and I haven't done it in a while, but maybe I'll go back to it. But the thing about the inconsistency of the downtown business community, the greater lobby group, and Chamber of Commerce being the greatest example, is how openly inconsistent and almost hypocritical they are. Again, when you look at how TIFs work as a whole entity, the entire city of Chicago pays for every TIF, and yet we're dedicated to this notion that a TIF tax is somehow exclusive to the people in the communities that are serviced by that TIF. So the notion is, the way in this crazy world that we have in Chicago, that if there's a TIF downtown, only people in the Loop are paying for it. And folks, that's just not true. Every time you create a TIF, everybody's taxes rise as a result of that TIF, no matter where the TIF is. And so, in contrast, we have something called, Special Service Area, an SSA. And at one point, Mayor Daley, when he was realizing that Millennium Park was not paying for itself, when he couldn't pay off the money he borrowed to build the parking garage and the park itself, proposed a special service area. And that's a special service area works this way. It's got very specific boundaries, and the tax rate goes up only within those boundaries. And so the people who live and pay taxes, own property in that boundaries, are the only one who pay for it. Well, as soon as he proposed that, people only who own property in the Loop pay only for Millennium Park, which of course raised the value of their property, there was an outcry. How could you do this? No taxation without representation. It's like they were reading my articles on TIFs and suddenly echoing it. And so he backed off. And he ended up financing it by selling about 3 parking garages, which, he then realized, what a great way this is. And then he went to the parking meters, but we're not going to talk about
that's for another
meters.
forum. That's for, okay.
So anyway, my point is that yes, the downtown business community is very sharp and very savvy, and they realized that the way that central flaw in the TIF program that I alluded to earlier, where blight is a designation that applies everywhere in Chicago, therefore giving them more money than the truly blighted communities would work to their advantage.
Okay, let me do this before I want to take some of your questions, but I want to fast forward to the current situation. Correct me if I'm wrong, there's roughly $1 billion available in TIF funds now. $1 billion sits in the pot, is that right?
That's it varies. I'd say, what is it, 700 million? We're talking about reserves alone?
Well,
Is that what you're talking about?
let's okay. So let's.
Every year, that's
Oh yeah, are you talking about the annual flowing in?
Well, I'm just saying that if I went to the TIF bank right now, and said I want to withdraw all the funds, what would the size of the check be?
Oh, I'd be about at least 700 million.
Okay. Now, that's the money we need to talk about right now because we have some proposals on the table to do some new things with that heretofore had been rejected by the mayor before they were even proposed. And one suggestion that's gained a lot of currency, even among aldermen and candidates, is this idea that that money go back to the taxing bodies from whence it came, and therefore you would do a great deal to alleviate these painful deficits. I.e., the Board of Education would get several $100 million to deal with its deficit. City of Chicago, a couple $100 million to cut into its shortfall. County of Cook, a piece of change that may or may not have an effect on the size of the sales tax. Good idea, Ben, or bad idea?
Well, yeah, I think it's a great idea. I agree with Rachel, although I don't know if she was advocating this, but she raised a point earlier about all the crucial development needs that have been TIF financed. I think most of them could have been financed the old-fashioned way where you borrow the money and pay it back with the property tax yield. That, I think, is a fair, more equitable way of doing development so that the money is more fairly and equitably spread around the city. So I would, if I were the king of the universe...
You mean mayor?
Yes, well, same thing, isn't it? But trust me, you don't want that.
If you think Pat Quinn is disorganized,
oh my God, Pat Quinn is a study of an organization compared to me. I would take what John Fritchie has proposed, and Tom Tresser sitting here in the second row has proposed, and I would to spend those reserves, give them back to the taxing bodies that desperately need them, so we can make some sense of what our true financial needs are.
And would you do that every year then? Would those be recurring revenues?
Well, okay, again, I'm back to being king of the universe here. I would, if I were king of the universe, pull the schools right out of the current TIF program.
Well, that's part of the Fritchie
until we
proposal.
had some reform in the way the TIFs work, and until we had, and at least in the first part of the equation, going back to the Harold Washington model that Rachel was pointing out, where you have a very defined project with limits on the amount of money you need for it and specific allocation, line item allocations. And then if I were the Board of Education, I would pursue it like whether it's a wise and prudent investment that would have returns that would not only pay back the money we are lending you, but then give us more money for the school children. That's how I would do it.
Okay, Tom and Rachel, what do you think? Tom, you deal with a statewide issue, but you know what's going on in Chicago. Do you think a reasonable case can be made for what they're talking about doing now, or is that short-sighted?
We have within the TIF statute the ability to declare a surplus if it's not earmarked, pledged, or otherwise obligated. I mean, there's a 3-year time frame. A windfall of cash in 1 year is not going to solve a problem that could be ongoing or could have been before the fact. I know that they changed the state aid formula or funding for Chicago Public Schools, so they're getting more this year, I believe. So, if you pull the schools out altogether anywhere, which it makes up more than 55 to 6% of the tax rate, TIFs would not be beneficial for any area in the state.
But I guess the question is, given the economic realities of 2010 and what we've all been through over the past couple of years, a lot of rules have to be changed because a lot of conditions have changed so dramatically that people could never have anticipated the last few years.
No.
So is it a reasonable thing to do now?
I leave that up to the state legislature.
Well, what I mean, this is a question for the city of Chicago. Do you think
That's
the case...
the city of Chicago's. No, I don't answer for
Rachel, do you think
Chicago.
it makes sense? Do you support that part of the Fritchie and Tresser and other people's plans? That right now...
I'm torn because on one hand, I agree with Tom. I think that it would be a one-time influx of cash, but there are some serious structural problems with the way we fund public services and development and infrastructure in this city and in American cities, quite frankly. What it would do is, I mean, I do agree with giving the money or a portion of the money back to CPS to deal with their own deficits and the problems. And what it would do is it would force, I think, the city to be a little smarter about, right? So the city would have half, essentially, of the kitty that it has on an annual basis. If the funds went back to or actually not even half, if the money went back to schools, that's 50% that's going back. And then you count all the other taxing jurisdictions, and pretty soon the city doesn't really have that much money to play around with. So that could force the city to use it more wisely, to really use it for projects that are really truly meeting the but-for requirement. Because I do see we are in called the new normal or sort of changed environment. I think it's exactly these kinds of times that call for a little bit of public assistance. Right?
Okay, well,
to
but
encourage the real estate market. It was during the last 10-year boom when private financing was readily available, cheap credit was available to the developers. Again, there couldn't be enough money flowing into real estate that I was scratching my head and saying, why is the public sector actively subsidizing this? Now that we're in sort of lean times, I actually think there is a role for the city to be very strategic about its public assistance, but where there could be a role for these
So during all the years when they didn't need the TIF money, it was rolling out the door, and now when they could probably use it a little more wisely, everybody else needs it even more. Mm-hmm. It sounds a little bit like the parking privatization fund, which was almost exhausted in the first year, even though it was supposed to live on in perpetuity. I mean, you're saying the risk is if you start allocating the TIF dollars now, they are one-year Band-Aids, unless you just do it permanently.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, and then think that a lot of that money has already been committed to paying off debt, right? So we couldn't just... Right now, I mean, even if Ben were mayor, he couldn't just wave a wand and sort of decommission all of those TIF districts. We have all these bondholders, investors who have become part of the system and who are waiting to be paid back with some of that TIF increment into the future. So even though there's something like $700 million generated annually in incremental revenue, portion of that, a big portion of that, has already been committed to projects that have been built.
Well, I just want to point out one point. Yeah, no, the $700 million, I guess I make myself clear. The $700 million is what the city claims is sitting in reserve that's not earmarked for any project, and that's what this teachers union and Fritchie and Tresser are all talking about in terms of, all right, you have $700 million sitting unearmarked, just sitting there, presumably gaining interest, although I've never taken a look at that actually. Let's take that out of the bank right now to pay these basic bills and erase our debt. That's the argument. Now, one alderman, I got to give him credit, Alderman Tom Allen, last year stood on the floor of the city council when the rest of the council was voting to empty the parking meter fund. And he said, why are we emptying this one-time fund? Once we spend this money, we'll never have it again. Let's spend the $700 million that's sitting in the TIF fund. And his argument is that TIFs do go on, well, not forever, but they go on for 23 years. So that money will come back, or a portion of that money would come back the following year. And so people say I'm always critical, but I gave him a shout out. I said, that's a good idea, Alderman Tom Allen. But I don't even think he voted for it. I think he just said it. So.
And this question of an audit of the TIF funds, very often an audit is a gratuitous suggestion that any politician makes to try to look concerned and informed. I mean, I would argue that a lot of the reporting in the Reader has been the equivalent of the audit because you've used FOIA so effectively. Has the TIF information been made sufficiently public by now? I know that over the years, one of the biggest complaints was it was like a shell game. The mayor, there were all these doors, and there's a little TIF money behind every door, but only one door is open at a time, and you never actually